Hello and welcome to Making Media Now, the Filmmakers Collaborative podcast. I'm your host, Michael Azevedo. On this episode, I welcome back journalist and media analyst Brandon Katz. Brandon's recent article in The Observer, titled The Decline of Originality in Hollywood, A Look at the Numbers, explores how original content in TV shows and movies has, over the past 15 years, lost out in a landslide to existing IP, intellectual property. Existing IP is defined as anything based on pre-existing material, such as comic books, novels, video games, podcasts, and musicals, including remakes, reboots, revivals, prequels, sequels, and spinoffs. If you look at the numbers, viewership and ticket sales, it's undeniable that IP-driven content is a powerhouse. Audiences flock to familiar characters and worlds, guaranteeing a certain level of viewership and, crucially, revenue. In a risk-averse industry, leaning on established IP is a seemingly safe bet. Brandon and I took a deep dive into this topic, and as usual, Brandon's comments are fact-based, diligently researched, and reveal a unique understanding of the media's creative aspirations and its financial preoccupations. Making Media Now is sponsored by Filmmakers Collaborative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting media makers from across the creative spectrum. From providing fiscal sponsorship to presenting an array of informative and educational programs, Filmmakers Collaborative supports creatives at every step in their journey. To learn more, visit filmmakerscollab.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please do like, share, follow, leave a review. Now on to my conversation with Brandon Katz. Hello, Brandon Katz. Welcome back to Making Media Now. Good to be speaking with you again.
Thank you so much for having me back on. I appreciate it. Clearly, I didn't burn the bridge too badly.
You did not. No bridge burning at all. We had a great chat a couple months back where you kind of helped us decipher a whole bunch of different analytics around streaming services. And about a week and a half ago, I saw an article that you published in The Observer called "The Decline of Originality in Hollywood," a look at the numbers, and just sort of give our listeners what the thesis of the article was, and then we'll start dissecting it.
Yeah, sounds good. I think anyone who is on film Twitter or is on TikTok and has an interest in the entertainment industry has seen a very common narrative that Hollywood has destroyed originality and Hollywood never makes anything new anymore. That's not totally true. The reality is that Hollywood responds to the needs and desires of the audience based on the money that they spend and the time that they spend. Audiences vote with their wallet, and over the last 15 years, they have made it very clear that originality and new-to-screen concepts isn't always what they want. There's room for it, but the truth is IP-based TV and film, intellectual properties based on books, comics, novels, video games, or remakes, sequels, prequels, spinoffs. Those are the things that consistently do the best commercially. So naturally, those are the things Hollywood makes a lot of.
So in your article, you're calling out the distinction between, say, original content, meaning that there was no pre-existing intellectual property around that, whether it was a novel that became a movie, that became a TV series, or maybe it was a podcast that became a movie series. When did the term intellectual property start being the defining term for this type of content, or really a whole swath of content?
It's a great question. And while my history of Hollywood is good, it probably doesn't date back to like the golden era of Hollywood. I would say it probably really entered a mainstream Hollywood lexicon in the 1980s, which was defined by the rise of franchises and kind of repetitive cash flow that those franchises represented, that also mirrored and reflected the kind of Reagan economics era type of trickle-down effect and the rise of commercial consumerism in America. So they're all very intertwined in terms of culture and art feeding into one another.
Yeah. So give our listeners an example about what you're talking about when you talk about IP. Maybe some, well-known examples.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to note that originality and new to screen concepts, even if new to screen concepts are based like on a book or a comic book, they just have never been adapted. Those are harder to pull off in terms of what audiences will buy into, in terms of what audiences are familiar with and know that they already like, which is why Hollywood has pushed more and more into familiar IP. And so if we wanted to look at just some major examples of 2024, this past year, Bridgerton, The Boys, The Lincoln Lawyer, Fallout, Futurama, Fool Me Once, Reacher, Young Sheldon, Law and Order SVU, all of those shows were among the most watched shows available on streaming in the US, according to Nielsen, in 2024. And that includes 7 of the 10 most watched streaming original shows, all based on IP. And so when I throw those names out, those are some of the most popular shows in the US and the world right now that I'm sure your audience is pretty familiar with, at least a handful of them.
So when you say they were based on IP, it means that in each instance, there was some other entity, whether it be a movie or a book or a TV show, that existed prior to the current iteration of each of those shows.
Exactly. So, for example, Bridgerton had a series of romance novels. The Boys, a hyper-violent comic book. The Lincoln Lawyer, legal drama novels that had already been adapted into the big screen. Fallout, an incredibly popular video game series. Every single one of those had source material, usually popular source material, that existed in another medium before it was translated to the screen.
So I feel like we very quickly get into sort of a chicken or egg element of this conversation. So our audience is watching all of this stuff because that's what the algorithm is throwing up at them, because they may have watched something like it. And so the algorithm is going to just flood them with something that feels similar and familiar and safe. Or are the studios saying, well, wait a minute, we just purchased this IP, this piece of intellectual property, and let's multi-version the hell out of it, and we'll stop when the audience screams uncle.
It's a really, really good question, Michael. And I will start off by saying the vaunted, mysterious algorithm and its powers are vastly overrated by the general public. It is a recommendation algorithm, and you can nudge people towards things, but it is not a decision maker, nor is an algorithm reverse engineering all of the programming we watch today. So the powers of the all-powerful algorithm are not as impressive as like smaller technical changes that, like, Netflix changes the poster on the tile of the title every once in a while on your Netflix account based on what you choose. That's actually a little bit more of a productive, technologically backed push to the right direction than the kind of recommendation algorithm. But to your exact question too, the chicken or an egg, what we've seen is that audiences will dive more into the kind of familiar IP realm than originals. And so Hollywood simply responds accordingly. So 13 of the 30 most watched titles on streaming, licensed series, original series, and movies in the US in 2024, all based on pre-existing material. Like I said, 7 of the 10 most watched originals. Of the top 66 movies to earn at least $100 million domestically in the last 3 years, 47 or 71% were part of an established franchise.
Yeah.
The 3 of the top 50 domestic grossers in that span, just 3, were completely original non-franchise films that weren't based on real-life events or adapted from source material. So clearly, that holds a sway. And one of the big reasons why it holds a sway is because audiences are already familiar with it. And today, Michael, I'm sure you know, and we all know, there is more competition for our attention spans than in the history of the world. We have so many screens and so many things to do on those screens that film and TV is no longer the only centerpiece of pop culture media. And so in this new attention-starved world that we find ourselves in, audiences are more and more only willing to invest time in something they already know that they like. And so is why the rise of IP continues rising.
That's an interesting angle that you take on it, the sort of the battle for attention. And it feels to me like that's also evident in the fact that the people are going with, that the audiences are going with things that seem safe and familiar and predictable because they really only need to give it a fraction of their attention. Like I've seen a variation of this a dozen times. I kind of know how it's going to work out. I'll look up from my phone when there's a cool special effect or when there's a particularly dramatic scene. So it almost feels to me in a way that this trend is emblematic of the war for attention.
So I think, yes, it's absolutely emblematic of how technology and distribution has changed the way we engage and consume entertainment media. But if you also look back, it's emblematic of a larger audience trend that dates back 15, 20 years. The last new to screen mega bucks franchise, live action, was The Hunger Games. And since then, every single thing that's really broken out in that plus $500 million range has been established or new. I mean, even Dune, which I will say for most generations counts as new to screen, it still had a 1980s film adaptation that was widely panned at the time. So it's really, really hard for something new to screen or something completely original to break through. Now, having said that, doesn't mean it doesn't happen. We've got John Wick, which has spawned a 4-film franchise that's grossed over $1 billion. It has a spin-off TV series on Peacock, and it has an upcoming spin-off movie with Ana de Armas, which looks absolutely awesome. We have things like Severance and The White Lotus, really esoteric, original, completely unique things that you wouldn't necessarily think on paper would break out as a broad appeal hit, and both have. So there is still room for these things, and originality and new to screen concepts will always be vital to the lifeblood and longevity and health of Hollywood, but it's harder and harder for them to break through these days.
Let's talk about the economics just for a bit. If I'm a studio and I own a particular piece of IP, am I more likely to go with, say, a streaming series based on that IP? Because, even if the streaming series doesn't succeed in the way that I had hoped, well, I still have that IP, and the lunch boxes are selling, or the theme park is still successful, or the video game aspect is still successful. So in other words, it's like, well, that aspect of the brand might have taken a hit, but the IP remains strong.
Absolutely. I think it's such an important distinction that a lot of people who are only consuming the on-screen content don't always factor into their rightful opinions. Now, I think the answer is twofold. Now, number one is TV is very IP driven because things like Fallout and Reacher, they didn't rely whatsoever on the pre-existing fame of their stars. They were either an ensemble cast or people that you may like, but you don't even necessarily know their name. But the IP of the source material was the big draw. So that's really helpful. And then B, you have, that multimedia franchise expansion. And we look at something like the Super Mario Brothers movie, which is an unbelievable example because not only was it just a massive smash hit in theaters with, I think, $1.4 billion worldwide, but it revitalized interest in Mario to the point where merch sales were up, video game sales were up. Nintendo launched the Super Nintendo World with the Super Mario World attraction as a premium immersive experience and garnered immense foot traffic as a result. So very often the on-screen adaptation of something is the flywheel for the greater IP franchise. Just like, Buzz and Woody are great on screen, but they really drive Disney parks rides and merchandise sales there and online. So there are so many levers to a piece of IP in today's multifaceted ecosystem that you can't judge it solely on one outing on TV or in film, usually.
Have you watched any of the Studio on Apple TV Plus with Seth Rogen?
I have, and I have the screeners for it, so I'm a little bit ahead, so I won't do any spoilers. But boy, what an unbelievably satirical yet still affectionate look at Hollywood.
Absolutely. But I think that, and I don't think you really, it's not a spoiler necessarily, but in the premiere episode, Seth Rogen plays this studio executive who has been waiting for decades to get his shot at the top, and he finally does. And his boss, just wonderfully played by Bryan Cranston, lets him know that his first assignment is going to be, talk about IP driven. I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, and it's unbelievable. He basically tasks him with making a Kool-Aid movie. And from there, somehow, some way, Martin Scorsese gets involved. There is betrayal and backstabbing and lies, and it's so amazing. And just for anyone who's interested in maybe checking out the show, I've never seen a show better represent how much people hate that they love something. And that's kind of what they're saying about Hollywood. They hate that they love it so much, and that it's so wonderful and so awful at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I'm watching the studio and I see that this guy is tasked with, making a film series around Kool-Aid. That's just insane. And then I read your article and I see that Mattel is developing 19 movies after the Barbie movie had, demonstrated what could be possible. I mean, my God.
And now, to be fair, Hollywood has a long history of massive volume of development with only maybe one or two things actually getting made. And I'm sure that'll be the case here. But it is funny and crazy and weird and wonderful to see that Barbie showed how a filmmaker-driven vision, a unique singular vision matched with atypical IP can work. Does that mean the next toy is going to work? Probably not. But when you have really sound creative execution, any idea can work. Yeah. We'll see if Mattel has the patience and the money to really give something the support and creative freedom that Barbie got, and Greta Gerwig, who is just an absolute genius.
You made a really good distinction a little while back when you were talking about how audiences, where once upon a time, maybe audiences would flock to a particular series or film because of the star.
Yeah.
So it almost didn't, the star was preeminent. Now it's sort of the IP. And I feel like there's no greater evidence of that than look at the Spider-Man or the Batman series. The leads are pretty much interchangeable. They are interchangeable because that's what they do. And yet the audiences still they're coming back. They're not necessarily saying, oh, I want to go see that because it's a Christian Bale movie or a George Clooney movie or I'm losing track of my Spider-Man. I think I tapped out at the Tobey Maguire for the face.
But you're absolutely right. Up until the early 21st century, the name above the marquee was the most important. And when you went to a movie strictly because you liked the actor or actress, because you felt you were in safe hands, you were much, much, much more likely to try original or new to screen concepts because you were going for the star. Now, the name of the marquee, the IP name itself has become the real value sell to audiences. So, for example, Chris Hemsworth as Thor is a star. That's a beloved matching of actor and character that people want to see. But do they want to see Chris Hemsworth as any other role? Not as much, through no fault of Chris Hemsworth, a very talented, kind of personable, charismatic star. So that's what the big switch has been. I mean, I think even for someone like Robert Downey Jr., who won an Oscar in Oppenheimer, but if you look at his non-Marvel roles since becoming Iron Man, they've struggled commercially, and as has many of the MCU kind of stars. I think Leonardo DiCaprio, who famously gave Timothée Chalamet advice, said no superhero movies and no hard drugs. No hard drugs is definitely a really good piece of advice. No superhero movies. You can see the pros and cons, because ultimately when you are defined by a single character, it's hard to create economic value and audience interest elsewhere outside of that character and that IP banner. So yeah, we've really seen a massive switch over the last 20 years in terms of audience preference and behavior. And again, that comes with pros and cons. But the moral of the story is that Hollywood has spent so many years kind of chasing the success of the Avengers that they've stopped making those mid-budget films, those adult-driven dramas, those star-driven concept pieces, those comedies and original films. And so in a way, they've trained audiences to not expect them in theaters, which has hurt. But again, it all comes back to theater audiences vote with their wallets. And for far too long, they weren't supporting the types of projects they claim online to desperately want.
The only thing I'm going to take issue with is I think Timothée Chalamet did play a superhero, but the superhero's name was Bob Dylan. So,
I think a lot of America would agree with you on that one.
Yeah. What is the distinction in this sort of IP rules the roost phenomenon within the worlds of streaming television, broadcast television, and film?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting kind of distinction. So IP-based TV series and films have really only accounted for about 12% of the supply from 2020 to 2024. And interestingly, they actually peaked in 2021. So the volume has actually decreased over the last couple of years. Having said that, they still punch far above their weight commercially. So if we look at the 100 most in-demand titles each year, according to Parrot Analytics, around 40 to 50% of the top 100 TV shows and 70 to 80% of the top 100 movies are based on pre-existing IP. And interestingly, the global demand share for IP-based movies has fallen slightly over the last 5 years, while the demand share for IP-based TV series has grown. And that gets back to what we were talking about with like Fallout and Reacher. On TV, it's easier to push the IP over the star. On film, again, obviously we've moved to more of an IP world, but having a star still helps. So it's interesting to see which are grafted onto which mediums. And actually my next article, or one of my next two articles for Observer, will be a follow-up on this one, showing like, are there certain mediums, IP, that are better suited to certain mediums? Are they driving attention or retention or acquisition on streaming? And looking at the specific value that they represent and drive in the industry.
Yeah. Not that long ago, you may remember this, there was something called Q scores or Q ratings that audiences, or sort of like focus groups, came away with and saying, well, this actor or this program registered high in the Q score. And there was a phenomenon for a while, particularly in the burgeoning days of what was called prestige TV, where even if a show wasn't doing big numbers, interested parties were pleased with who was watching. So in other words, it typically was driven by socioeconomics. So, maybe not a lot of people are watching this TV show or this cable show, but the people that do watch, they have a lot of money to spend. So you could either pair that with advertising, or you could pair that even in the promotion of the show with whether it was product placement or advertising. Is that even a thing anymore?
So I'm both of my parents are lifelong PR professionals, so I'm a big fan of the Q score. But the reality is that it's a somewhat archaic metric today. When instead of paying private consulting hundreds of thousands of dollars to kind of drum up Q scores, you could just go on social media and look, wow, this person has X amount of followers across these platforms and their audience is ABC. Yeah. And so it's so much easier for studios, networks, and brands to figure out what their penetration and reach is of a personal star, a star, as opposed to what it was 25, 30 years ago. Now, to your other point, there are still absolutely value drivers in entertainment that aren't home run TV shows or movies. So I think of something like Amazon Prime in the US over indexes with female audiences. But shows like Reacher and shows like Invincible draw a highly male audience. And something like Invincible also drives a highly young male audience. That's a really good juxtaposition to the general Amazon Prime target demo, which is women with disposable income who are doing a lot of shopping. Of course, men too, but typically, as industry research shows, women control a lot of the purse strings in American marriages. So the fact that those shows are building out a more complete, more robust audience demographic profile is really important to the value of Amazon Prime Video. Then you have shows like let's see. Like Wednesday is a smash hit. Everybody's watching Wednesday. But something like uh, Baby Reindeer is a much, much, much smaller hit made on a fraction of the price and engaging in a totally different, very targeted audience. That's
Right.
still important to advertisers. That's still important to Netflix, who want to be a four quadrant service that appeals to men, women, old, young. So there's absolutely still micro value. And I actually think what's really interesting about the streaming era as opposed to the linear era is that there's a more multifaceted definition of success beyond just raw viewership. Because, Michael, I could tell you, hey, Friends is popular. Great. What insights can we glean from that we already knew?
Yeah.
It's a deeper picture in streaming.
And draw a distinction between familiar IP, almost repetitive IP, almost, sort of duplicative IP, versus a genre that is successful. For instance, I think of the network broadcast networks are still so invested in the procedural, whether it's the police procedural or the medical procedural. So just talk a little bit about the difference between genre and IP.
I think you nailed the focus area to answer this question, and that is broadcast procedural. Law and Order is a franchise IP. It is a brand that you're familiar with and has been spun off in multiple directions in order to engage audiences in multiple ways. But the genre is the procedural, and a procedural is defined by, a broadcast series that usually wraps up its plot beginning, middle, and end all in the space of a single episode, and usually revolves around positions of authority: cop, doctor, legal, a guy with a gun. Those are kind of the definitive procedural focuses, and like an IP is the successful franchises within it. So you've got your Law and Orders, you've got your FBI's, you've got your 911s. Those are all examples of IP within the umbrella genre of, procedural drama.
And do you think that, I feel like the headline, "How come there's no originality in Hollywood?" is almost evergreen. You published your article in 2025. I guarantee somebody published a similar article in 2020, in 2015, in 1985. Can you think readily about any sort of antecedents to this phenomenon where the cry from folks who were seeking perhaps more originality was similar to what you're saying right now, but there was a different reason. There was a different thing. Like, for instance, I remember being a kid when the disaster movies, like every movie was a disaster movie with a star-studded cast, which for me, that kind of feels like what the Marvel universe is. It's a star-studded cast, somewhat interchangeable plots. And there were probably journalists, and media analysts back then who were writing about, Hollywood can free up the money for Earthquake 4, but they can't fund the latest Coppola film.
I think Hollywood has always been driven by finite trends and fads, which is pretty much how the rest of the world works too. You had, in early Hollywood, musicals. Once we had sound and talkies, as they were known as, musicals were huge. And then they gave way to Westerns as the dominant genre, which then in the 1970s, thanks to Star Wars and Superman, gave way to a rush of sci-fi. And then within that, it started to splinter. Alien was like, okay, let's tap into the sci-fi genre, sci-fi fad right now, but let's do it from the complete opposite end of the spectrum as Star Wars and go horror. Then 80s were defined by franchises. 90s had a lot of really original, unique things. And it also had the Disney Renaissance with animated films coming back in full force, and Pixar entering the ecosystem. Then the last 20-ish years have been defined by superhero films. Now we're seeing that genre beginning to wane and wobble. So there'll always be dominant genres that attract audience attention and audience spend, until they don't. And then they'll find something new. And I'd say, again, I'd go back to the data point. The fact is there still is originality in Hollywood. Remember, IP-based films and TVs only cover about 12% of the supply over the last 4 years. there is so much original filmmaking and television production being made right now. It's on the streaming services to have better discoverability of these original things, and B, it's also on the audience to go hunt for it. I remember having a conversation with an ex-girlfriend's aunt in which she was like, they just keep making the same movie over and over. I'm like, I understand why you feel like that, because you're probably only paying attention to the wide release, huge movies you see marketed, which are about 60 movies a year, but more than 1,000 movies were released, last year. Go look for it. I promise you'll find all manner of different types of movies. So originality still exists. It's not as popular as IP, but it's there, and it will always find its way into new genres and new forms and new formats, just like IP-based genre trends will amalgamate other genres to try to sustain their popularity. It's a kind of snake eating its own tail, but never not interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And you say, it's only 12%, and yet that 12% is garnering what percentage of the eyeballs? A huge percentage, no?
Yeah, so TV 40 to 50% of the top 100, films 70 to 80% of the top 100 most in-demand films and TV shows, according to Parrot Analytics. And it is important to note that we are obviously in this article and in this conversation, we are focusing on high-performing titles. Why are we doing that? Because movies that fail to drum up any business at the box office, or TV shows that fail to capture any significant tune-in, they don't move the needle. They won't be repeated because they're not making any financial kind of value for their creators and owners. We are talking about the slice of entertainment that pushes the medium forward, that pushes entertainment forward and actually garners the most money, because it is the most important. I even mentioned in the article, I love originality and new-to-screen concepts. I love the Sundance Channel's TV show Rectify and Tim Blake Nelson's movie last year, Bang Bang. I have never met a single person who didn't work in entertainment who knew of either that TV show or that movie.
Oh, I was a huge devotee of Rectify. I thought it was one of the it was beautiful.
It's one of my favorite shows of all time, and nobody has ever seen it. And it just goes to show you how the peak TV era really had too much TV, but B, how quality and newness and originality and creativity does not guarantee commercial success.
So do you see, or are you in the know of anything that's maybe on the horizon that might threaten the hegemony of IP with either a particular streaming series or even a network series that's coming out?
I think right now one of the most popular shows in the world is Netflix's Adolescence, a 4-part miniseries that unfortunately follows a very brutal crime and the impact that it has on the family of the perpetrator. And that was inspired by the rise of knife attacks in the UK. It's a British series, but it's not based on any piece of IP. And yet it is on track right now to become one of Netflix's 10 most watched English language series of all time, according to their metrics. And B, some of the most powerful, gripping TV I've seen in the last year. I think right now I have it as my number 2 or number 3 favorite show of 2025 so far. So highly recommend that. And then, of course, in movies, something will always break through. Every year we have something break through. Again, it doesn't do as consistently well as your big IP franchises, but there's always something that really makes you step back and go, wow, what an unbelievably creative, fresh idea that just took me away to a different place.
Two analogies from the world of politics keep popping into my head. There's actually it's sort of, two cliches, I guess, that the one is you get the government you deserve. So do we get the streaming options we deserve because we're watching the mid stuff, so to speak. But then the other one is if the people lead, the leaders will follow. So, your tale with Netflix's success with Adolescence seems to illustrate that. Well,
ultimately, at the end of the day, if things like The Hate U Give in 2017, 2018, or TV shows that were totally new, if they garnered huge viewership and huge blockbuster box office results, we would see more of them. They would be a more consistent, hot button, high profile ticket at our entertainment destinations. The fact that they're not speaks volumes, sadly.
Well, it's a fascinating topic. Lots of fascinating topics within the topic. And again, speaking with Brandon Katz, who wrote an article for The Observer. He's a frequent contributor to The Observer. It came out on the 25th of March, so it's still up online. Go find it. And you said you've got a kind of a follow-up to that being published when?
Sometime in the next couple of weeks. I'm still writing it, but I'm excited to dive into it more.
Okay. So listen, if folks want to follow you on socials or follow your work as it gets published, where should they be looking?
They can follow me on Twitter at @great_Katzby. You can go and LinkedIn me at Brandon Katz, Katz. Very happy to connect. I write for outlets like Observer and Supercluster, and hopefully have a few other really cool, fun things on the horizon as well that I think you guys will enjoy.
Awesome. Well, Brandon, always fun to talk with you. I like that you pair the numbers with a real passion for media and a super deep well of information, around TV and movies. It's a pleasure.
I appreciate that. All I say is that I'm a proud couch potato.
Couch potato pride. There you go. All right, man. Thanks again for your time.
Thanks for having me.